It was supposed to be so easy when Russian President Vladimir Putin started his special military operation in Ukraine in February 2022. He believed that it would be over in a matter of weeks. He'd amassed 200,000 soldiers for the job, including some of the most combat-hardened veterans in the Russian military, who were tasked with sweeping into Kiev and taking Ukraine's capital. It almost worked. A rapid advance through February 2022 and into March saw Russia claim Sumy, Kherson, Mariupol, and parts of Kharkiv. Its forces managed to get to the edges of Kiev before the Ukrainian pushback. Between March 2022 and October 2022, Ukraine forced Russia to make several humiliating retreats, with Russia's forces losing their positions in Sumy and Kharkiv, and thus losing their passage into Kiev. That was almost 2 years ago. Ever since, Russia has found itself locked in a war of attrition at which it has thrown hundreds of thousands of soldiers and untold thousands of tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles at a country that simply won't budge under the pressure. And now, Putin faces the very real prospect that Russia could run out of equipment before he's able to achieve his goal of taking Ukraine. At least, that's the opinion of a former NATO deputy assistant to the Secretary General named Jamie Shee. Speaking to Times Radio in July 2024, she suggested that Putin might be forced to wind down his efforts to take Ukraine, and that it's very possible that he simply won't be able to take the entire country. In this video, we're going to examine Shee's 28-minute interview with Times Radio, picking out key points while highlighting the evidence that may well prove Shee correct. She starts the interview by highlighting how the war doesn't look great for Ukraine right now. He points out that the failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023 took a toll on the country's military. That counteroffensive, which ran from the summer of 2023 through the beginning of November, had the goal of breaching the war's front lines, allowing Ukraine's forces to break back into territory that Russia had taken since February 2022. Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia were specific targets, with Ukraine managing to capture 14 villages in those regions. However, Russia had been preparing for the counteroffensive since November 2022 and was granted even more time to prepare when weather and weapons issues delayed the operation from its original spring date to midsummer. That time gave Russia a chance to fortify, meaning it was able to mostly hold the front lines. By November 2023, Ukrainian General Valery Zaluzhny was saying that the war was a stalemate, which essentially amounted to an acknowledgement that the counteroffensive had failed. She claims this failed counteroffensive, combined with America's 6-month delay in approving the $61 billion in military aid that Ukraine badly needed, has allowed Russia to make some significant gains. During the first half of 2024, the Russians have been pushing, though thus far not decisively. They haven't managed to capture Kharkiv in the north, although they shelled the city and destroyed a lot of buildings. Shia told the Times, Russia has had more success to the south, nearer to the Crimean territory that it annexed in 2014. She says it has captured several villages and, in some cases, come across Ukrainian defenses that were poorly prepared. However, there is solace for Ukraine, the former NATO man claims. If you look at the massive Russian advantage on paper, manpower mobilization, potential missile production, tank production, and everything the Russians can throw in vis-a-vis what the Ukrainians have, Russia has not been able to translate that advantage on paper into a decisive strategic advantage on the ground. Shia says he appears to be right. In fact, it appears that the war has been at the stalemate. General Zaluzhny claimed it to be back in November 2023. At its peak in March 2022, Russia controlled about 27% of Ukraine's territory, about 63,000 square miles. That was cut back to 19%, or 44,000 square miles, a month later after Ukraine had successfully pushed the invading Russian forces back. Since then, and even during Ukraine's counteroffensive, the percentage has hovered around the 20% mark. Some of the most recent figures, unveiled by the Center for Preventive Action in May 2024, claim that Russia now controls 18% of Ukraine, amounting to 42,000 square miles. In short, it spent 2 years trying to flex its military muscle only to have made no real progress in terms of territory gained. Based on this, she says there are now 2 keys to Ukraine's ability to potentially push Russia back. First, the flow of weapons into Ukraine. Xie points out that artillery is the key here, explaining that it's responsible for about 80% of soldier deaths on both sides. Consistency in getting hold of that artillery will help Ukraine to repel Russia further. Thankfully for Ukraine, several nations have committed to providing military aid over the long term to resolve this consistency challenge. The UK, for instance, has pledged to give Ukraine $3 billion per year in military aid for as long as it takes, according to a July 2024 report in The Guardian. Second, Ukraine faces a manpower shortage. Xie highlights that the country is already trying to counteract this problem by introducing a new conscription law, which requires all Ukrainian men aged between 18 and 60 to register with the country's military. Only those aged 25 and over can be mobilized, a lowering of the previous minimum age of 27. But it's clear that Ukraine needs to raise a new army, according to Xie. The first army is tired, and many of the soldiers have been killed or wounded, he says. Raising that second army is going to be a key challenge for Ukraine. Xie adds, because the second generation of soldiers it'll recruit will likely need more training and be less motivated to fight than those who are in Ukraine's initial army. By this point, you may be wondering what any of this has to do with Russia running out of equipment. If anything, these figures show that Ukraine has both equipment and manpower issues that it needs to handle. That is certainly the case, according to Xie. But Russia has its weaknesses in these areas as well. Xie points out that Russia began the war with enormous stockpiles of old Soviet-era equipment, weapons, tanks, and artillery, much of which had been mothballed for decades, were at Russia's disposal. On top of that, Xie says Russia has been firing missiles into Ukrainian towns and cities every night, sending drones into Ukraine, and essentially bombarding the country constantly. That's created a problem. A lot of these things have been used up, according to Xie. The numbers seem to back this assertion. In a July 2024 piece, The Economist claimed that Russia had lost around 3,000 tanks and 5,000 other armored vehicles during the first year of the war. These appear to be conservative estimates. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance puts the numbers at 8,399 tanks and 16,203 armored vehicles. The real numbers likely lie somewhere in the middle. Either way, they amount to massive losses for Russia, with many of these tanks and vehicles having been pulled from Soviet-era stockpiles. What's the result of these losses? Xie points out that Russia has had to go to other countries to replenish its stockpiles. You've seen Putin having to go to North Korea, having to go to China, having to go to Iran, all to get these things on the international markets. Again, we've seen this happening throughout the war. Most recently, Russia has signed a mutual defense pact with North Korea, which sees each nation promising to come to the other's defense if they're attacked. This appears to be a preemptive measure by Russia, with it perhaps intending to use the pact to bring North Korea into its special military operation, should Ukraine attack Russia on its own soil. What more likely is that Russia will use this pact to secure more missiles and artillery. South Korea already claims that North Korea has sent up to 5 million artillery shells to Russia as of June 2024. As for the other countries, Xi mentions Iran is believed to have provided around 400 missiles to Russia as of February 2024, most of which come from its FAT 110 group of short-range ballistic missiles. China bucks the trend to an extent, as it hasn't crossed the line into supplying lethal weapons to Russia yet. However, as Sky News reported in May 2024, it has been sending components such as jet parts, ball bearings, semiconductors, and a host of other parts Russia can use when manufacturing its own weapons. The fact that all of this is happening is actually bad news for Russia, claims Xi. It's now finding itself vying in the same international markets for military equipment that it used to supply. And though Russia has superiority in terms of sheer numbers when it comes to equipment, its need to strike deals to get more shells, missiles, and components from other countries shows that the country's Soviet-era stockpiles are far from infinite. They can, and likely will, run out. Putin recognizes this distinct possibility, claims Xi, which is why he's changed his objectives since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Putin's objectives are fairly limited now, claims Xi. I don't believe personally that he thinks he can subjugate all of Ukraine as much as he would like. Instead, Putin likely has eyes on fully capturing the portion of Ukraine that Russia partially holds. These would include Donetsk and Mariupol, with Xi claiming that Putin likely thinks he can declare a victory of sorts before imposing a stalemate on Ukraine, much like was done following the annexation of Crimea. The goal now, Xi claims, try to get the West to push Ukraine to the negotiating table. Again, there are signs that this is the case. In May 2024, Reuters ran a piece in which it noted that 4 Russian sources close to Putin believe that he's ready to negotiate a ceasefire with Ukraine that would halt the war on condition that Russia gets to keep the territory it has claimed. That ceasefire would be followed by negotiations, which could lead to Putin claiming the type of victory that Xi describes. Asked about the Reuters report during a conference in Belarus, Putin simply said, "Let them resume," in regard to negotiations, but any conversation would have to be based on the realities on the ground, rather than what Ukraine and the West want from the negotiations. Another way to read all of this is that the negotiations would stem from the weapons and equipment issue. Knowing that he's quickly burning through his Soviet-era stock, to the point where Russia is now relying on other countries for equipment, Putin needs a way to get out of the war. A ceasefire followed by negotiations that lead to Russia taking some Ukrainian territory would be ideal for him. Not only would the ceasefire give Putin a small window to rebuild Russian equipment stocks, but it would allow him to justify the combat loss of 579,490 soldiers, assuming Ukraine's official war website provides accurate figures. Xi says this isn't Putin's ideal outcome. Instead, it's an outcome to which he may be forced simply because Russia is running out of the equipment it needs to sustain the war at the level it currently is. That's why Putin is hoping for Trump to win in the upcoming American presidential elections, says Xi, as Trump has repeatedly talked about the possibility of taking the U.S. out of NATO. With the U.S. out of NATO, Putin would have a stronger negotiating position when trying to force Ukraine to cede the portions of its territory that Russia currently occupies. Of course, none of this would mean that the war between Russia and Ukraine is over for good. I wouldn't hazard a guess that Putin wouldn't give it another go in 5 or 10 years, once he's reconstituted his military, she says, while referencing comments made by outgoing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg that NATO needs to prepare for up to a decade of conflict between Russia and Ukraine. All of this would be a result of Russia running out of equipment to sustain the war. But the most worrying thing, according to Shia, is that failing to take all of Ukraine now wouldn't necessarily constitute the full failure for Russia. He notes that Russia is often perfectly happy to live within what he calls frozen conflicts, fights that have landed in a stalemate with no prospect of a lasting settlement. Moldova and Georgia offer examples of this, Shia claims, with Russia happy to keep those conflicts frozen because that allows it to maintain a measure of control. All sides have to speak to them to have any chance of ending the conflict, a tactic that Russia may use to exert constant pressure on Ukraine even as Russia's weapons stockpiles run low. Living within that period of uncertainty would also offer Putin opportunities, Shia claims. He believes that, at some point in the near future, we'll see a winding down of the Ukraine war that results in a solidification of the current front lines. Russia will curtail its attacks as it fortifies, building trenches and defenses along these front lines to ensure Ukraine can't advance while also sitting back to conserve resources. As she explains, Putin, who has of course suffered big losses in terms of men and equipment, would need to rebuild his army. Whether he'd try to take Ukraine again in 5 to 6 years after the drawing up of these stalemated front lines remains to be seen. There's just one problem for Russia. Using this tactic would also give Ukraine and NATO a chance to prepare. Unlike Georgia and Moldova, neither of which receive sustained support from the West, when dealing with Russia, Ukraine has benefited from a constant flow of weapons from NATO-aligned countries. Those weapons have played a huge role in Ukraine's managing to prevent Russia from taking territory, with the ever-tightening bonds between Ukraine, NATO, and the European Union, also enabling a modernization of the country's military. As Shia points out, the NATO point of view is that entering a frozen conflict would mean the war stalls while Ukraine is still a functioning nation that is now anchored to the West. That anchoring would give NATO the time it needs to rebuild. That rebuilding is already in process. The International Institute for Strategic Studies notes that NATO's total military spending increased by 11% in 2024 compared to an increase of just 3% the year prior. In Europe, the numbers are even higher. NATO's European members have combined to commit to spending 19% more on their militaries in 2024 than they did in 2023. A frozen conflict would also offer temporary solace to the Baltic states of Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, all of which could be possible next targets for Russia if it were able to take Ukraine. What would all of this mean for Putin? Creating a stalemate to give himself time to rebuild the Russian military, both through internal production and by purchasing equipment from allies, isn't as strong a strategy as it first appears. Yes, Russia would rebuild while Putin could claim a small victory if the stalemate establishes front lines that allow him to act as though he's permanently taken Ukrainian territory. But if he does return to his special military operation 5 or 6 years after creating a frozen conflict, he'll be dealing with a very different Ukraine. A Ukraine that not only has a modernized military, but also has the backing of NATO countries that will have spent those 5 years investing in their own militaries. The pause could work in NATO's favor, assuming a pause comes. However, there's still the question of whether Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, would even allow such a pause. Shia notes that Zelensky held a phone call with former and potential future President Donald Trump in July 2024, though the details of that call aren't known. Trump apparently called it a very good call before stating that he'll work to negotiate a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia if he's elected. A source close to Zelensky seemed to echo those statements, according to Politico, who quoted the source as claiming that Trump pledged to achieve a just peace in Ukraine if he wins back the White House. She suggests that Trump, for all of his bluster, may continue along the multilateral approach already being taken toward Russia, relying on a cooperative effort to isolate Putin and pressure him into making a deal that would be favorable to Ukraine. Of course, Shia claims that all depends on which advisor Trump is listening to. Should he become president, as it's very possible, he'll change his mind again if that time comes. At this point, the Times radio interviewer brings up another possibility. What if Trump wins the presidency and decides that the U.S. will provide no more military aid to Ukraine? Would Europe have both the political and financial will to continue to fund Ukraine's war effort? Or would the U.S., leaving the conflict, mean that Putin's problems with manpower and equipment don't result in Russia being forced to scale back its invasion? In other words, could Europe keep Ukraine on a stable war footing? Shia calls this the $64,000 question, though he also suggests this very question was confronted very recently. In July 2024, Colorado played host to the Aspen Security Conference, which is an annual gathering of world leaders that offers a neutral platform in which those leaders can discuss matters of foreign policy and national security. The issue of the U.S. withdrawing aid was raised during that conference, with the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken fielding the question. Blinken pointed out that 23 countries have signed bilateral security agreements with Ukraine that, in many cases, promise ongoing aid for periods of up to 10 years. In total, these agreements promise at least $37.7 billion to Ukraine, not all of which will come from the United States. Much of the money is being pledged by Ukraine's European partners, as well as emerging partners in the Asia-Pacific region. Japan, for instance, has recently promised $12 billion in financial aid to Ukraine, with debates still raging in the country over whether it should supplement this with military aid. Blinken highlighted these agreements, noting that even if the U.S. drops out, Ukraine still has 22 partners providing money and military support to help keep it stocked, so it can slowly whittle away at Russia's already declining equipment levels. She notes these comments are somewhat disingenuous. Though Blinken is right that these agreements exist, he also notes the Council on Foreign Relations in New York calculates that America's contributions total about $107 billion thus far, while that is actually less than the amount that's been provided by EU nations, particularly when taking financial aid into account along with military aid. It's still a very significant portion of the money Ukraine has received, a portion that Ukraine can't afford to lose. The loss of the U.S. would also cause issues elsewhere. For instance, she notes that NATO is relying on American bases, such as those in Germany, to serve as locations where it can provide training to Ukrainian troops. Would the U.S. withdrawing its financial support extend to it also preventing Ukraine from using these bases? That's a question that will go unanswered unless the situation arises. But if it did happen, European NATO members would find it difficult to replace all of the logistical advantages that come from America contributing to Ukraine, even when taking money out of the equation. The conclusion appears to be that the U.S. is still vital in helping Ukraine to fend off Russia. Without American support, Ukraine loses tens of billions of dollars in weaponry and perhaps just as damaging, possibly loses access to the training it needs to use the American weapons systems it's receiving from its other European allies. All of that would play right into Putin's hands. Ukraine losing support from the U.S. might mean that Putin can slow down his invasion without fully stopping it, freeze the conflict on the front lines to rebuild his army, knowing that Ukraine will struggle to rebuild its military due to the loss of support. Of course, this is all speculative. The U.S. has made no announcements about withdrawing support, and Blinken was likely discussing the possibility based on Trump winning the presidency. Right now, Ukraine is getting enough support to keep plugging away at Russia's ever-declining equipment numbers. Assuming that continues, there's only one real result for Russia. Shia claims it will be seen as less of a threat as the Ukraine war continues. That perception doesn't just stem from Russia running out of equipment and losing enormous amounts of manpower. It also comes from the fact that Putin has been quick to throw threats toward countries that aid Ukraine, but as of the creation of this script, hasn't followed through on a single one of them. In June 2022, he was threatening Sweden and Finland with war if either nation allowed NATO to install infrastructure in their countries. Both are now members of NATO, and Putin hasn't done a thing. Almost 2 years later, Putin was threatening the UK following remarks by former Home Secretary David Cameron suggesting that Ukraine could use any weapons the UK provides how it sees fit. That would include using them on Russian territory. Again, no follow-through from Putin. This constant pattern of unfulfilled threats, combined with Russia's litany of equipment issues, has only raised Western confidence in the idea that Putin isn't strong enough to declare war on the rest of Europe. In fact, Russia may be so weak that it can't sustain the war in Ukraine for as long as Putin needs to finally take the country. This has resulted in the West growing increasingly confident in crossing the red lines, with each of those lines being an action that many believe would escalate tensions between Russia and the West. As Shia points out, the U.S. and Europe imposed many of these red lines themselves during the beginning of the Ukraine war, and both have since crossed several of them. In the beginning, it was just helmets, no lethal weapons, says Shia. Then it was no tanks. The UK became the first to supply tanks. Then it was no long-range artillery. Then it was never to F-16s. One by one, our self-imposed red lines have been crossed, and we see that, ultimately, Putin is not going to launch a war against the West. The West has slowly realized that it has more scope for risk than it believed at the beginning of the Ukraine war. That has resulted in Ukraine receiving increasingly higher amounts of military aid, as well as getting permission to use the weapons it receives to attack Russia on its own territory. Why does that matter in the context of Russia's problems with manpower and equipment? The threats it has levied to the West, which it has already failed to follow through upon, only get weaker as it burns through its Soviet-era stockpiles while fighting Ukraine. All the while, Ukraine is receiving influxes of equipment from its Western allies, allowing it to restock as Russia goes scrambling to the few allies it has to replenish its stocks. So, where does all of this leave Putin? His invasion of Ukraine is a failure, at least in the context under which it was originally launched. Russia hasn't conquered Ukraine. It holds less than 20% of the country's territory. And right now, Russia doesn't have the equipment or the manpower it needs to take all of Ukraine, at least not without suffering so many losses that it'll practically be left without an army once the war ends. As a result, Putin is looking to buy time. Declaring a ceasefire on his own terms would help, as it may allow him to create a frozen conflict during which time he'll rebuild Russia's arsenals. But Ukraine and NATO are wise to his plans. Both would also use the time to rebuild and get stronger to guard against a future secondary invasion. She believes we'll see Putin's invasion wind down in the coming months as a result of these equipment issues. It's what happens after that's up for debate. So, what do you think? Will we see Russia edge close to a ceasefire in the coming months so it can consolidate and rebuild? Or do you think Putin will keep pushing even as he watches his soldiers fail to take true advantage of the Russian military's supposed strength on the ground in Ukraine? Share your opinions in the comments below, and thank you for watching this video. Now go check out Russia is running out of everything: planes, ships, soldiers, tanks, or click this other video instead.